Uh, Hello, everybody. Nice to see you once again in the morning. I see that it's very early for many people, but we came. And I'd like to introduce Kaja Kaźmierska, is director of our institute, and she is very well-known researcher in the field of biographical studies, and she created also the Center for Biographical Studies here, and maybe she tells more about it in a few minutes. Then welcome, Kaja, and to the presentation, Doing Biographical Research, Ethical Dilemmas in Changing Social Context, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to this conference. I'm really confused because in our institute are a lot of prominent scholars who do sociological research in paradigm of symbolic interactionism and interpretative sociology, and I'm actually a student of them. Anyway, during the studies, I was at once oriented to the interpretative sociology and interpretative paradigm, and I chose as my main field of interest biographical studies, which are also rooted in interpretative sociology. So when we were discussing the topic of my presentation, we decided that I will focus on my own field, but I will try to attract you with some thoughts which may perhaps go a little bit beyond this field, as I'm going to share with some reflections related with some ethical issues. But just to start to put me in the context, I would say that biographical method and research have in Poland very rich tradition, reaching the very origin of biographical approach in word sociology. Just to name Thomas and Znaniecki, Polish peasant in Europe and America, and yesterday we talked about anniversaries, and next year we will have the 100th anniversary of publishing this book. And for years, biographical research was even called the Polish method. It was due to great popularity of biographical method in times of its almost complete neglectfulness in the word sociology, like when this functionalist structuralist paradigm was the most fashionable and regarded. And due to outstanding scholars who developed it, like Florian Znaniecki or his student Józef Hałasiński, who, by the way, created sociology at our university. As we know, in the last 20 decades of the 20th century, biographical research started rapidly developing. It has been established not only as one of methodological approaches, but also as a result of specific theoretical thinking about social reality, social processes, and the role of sociological reasoning. At the same time, we must keep in mind that, like in other fields, biographical research has various theoretical frames. Just to give an example of French school, mainly represented by Daniel Berthaud, who sees social realities as existing independently of the conscious minds of social actors, who only mirror this already identified reality more or less faithfully. So we may say that Berthaud represents a sort of realistic approach, very well rooted in the tradition of French sociology as such. Whereas the German school strongly refers to concepts which are rooted in the tradition of interpretative sociology, such as Chicago School, pragmatism, symbolic interactionism, ethnomethodology, conversation analysis, sociolinguistic, and grounded theory. The most prominent application and elaboration in this direction can be found in Fritz Schitze's work, According to this German sociologist, single case documents are not only rigorously sequentially analyzed with regard to their contents, but also concerning the procedures of reference and accounting. What is first hidden in recorded and transcribed materials becomes empirically and systematically analyzable. With reference to qualitative research in Chicago's tradition, Schitze developed new key concepts, and his work in the field of biographical research shows how sociological understanding and knowledge rely both on elaboration and theoretical concepts and adequacy of data collection and analysis. I did this short comment just to put my reflection in the frame of this second approach in my work that I have tried to follow for many years. That is the methodology of Fritz Schitze, which can be considered as not only a sort of analytical tool, but also as the complex theoretical reasoning based on mentioned interpretative approaches. And just to explain my to some sort of fascination with his work, I can say that he first came when I still was a student at the end of the 80s. He came to our university, and he is the one of German sociologists who introduced the interpretative sociology into German sociology in the 70s, inviting such prominent persons as Anselm Strauss, as Goffman, as Sigurel, and many others. They had seminars in Germany, and then they translated lots of this canonic texts of interpretative sociology into German. Now I would like to pass to this main topic of my presentation, that is various ethical dilemmas related to the very act of social research and to some circumstances connected with changing social and cultural contexts. I will base my comments and experiences coming from the field of biographical research, yet I think that at least some of them can be applied to other types of research as well, especially in the field of qualitative studies. We may say that from the very beginning, ethical problems of biographical interviewing have been focused on the very relationship between a narrator and interviewer, the promise of anonymity and methodological responsibility. Just to remind briefly, when biographical approach was revived and new techniques like recorded narratives were introduced, an interviewee, that is the narrator or informant, started to be regarded not only as a source of knowledge delivering the needed data, but also as an independent interpreter and social constructor of reality. The assumption of mutual trust and methodological responsibility of a researcher was the main frame of social interaction. This assumption should guarantee that results of the research would not go beyond the academic frame. I think that these aspects of doing biographical research used to be a sort of innovative approach to interviewees who started to be treated to some extent as co-authors of the research process, because they constructed and gave their life stories in the presence of a researcher. This attitude is still, or should be still, regarded as pivotal, and is of course also related to some ethical problems. Just to name three of them. The first is discrepancy between the researcher and the interviewee knowledge about the process of analysis. Our interviewees are informed about the purpose of our projects. They know that we will analyze their stories, but they can hardly imagine what could be done with the text, how it may be analyzed, what are the procedures of reference and accounting. The second problem, facing the difficult interaction situation when a narrator presents in her story, for instance, prejudice or negative stereotypes, and a researcher as interactional partner in a way is co-author of this situation. And actually, the researcher is very interested in having these stories full of prejudice and stereotypes, because it's perfect material to analysis. Nevertheless, sometimes we may feel uncomfortable when simply listening to such declarations. And the third dilemma, how to define the research situation which is a formal situation but framed by informal interactional rules. When we ask somebody to tell us her life, we must be involved in the ambivalences like formal versus informal, private versus public, engagement versus distance. Researchers try to solve this problem by constructing a number of procedures and regulations, including ethical codes, but in my opinion, it does not solve all the problems, and I will come to this later. I would now focus more on some new dilemmas caused by dynamic changes of different spheres of social life, including social sciences. These that I want to mention and discuss can be put in different frames of reference, but they equally strongly influence the condition of biographical research. For example, over-interpreted interdisciplinarity, commercialization of science, digitalization of data, social media. Some new standards have been implemented from hard sciences. The research situation has been shaped by circumstances related to wider cultural changes. I will start from the most crucial point, discussing the condition of biographical research. I would like to focus on ethical problems, yet understood in a wide frame, including also ethic of the very work done by biographical researcher. In other words, I would like to devote some time for the reflection on the quality of contemporary studies in this field, showing that quite often researchers are not keen to reflect on their ethic of work, understood as elaborate, systematic exploring of the methodology they use. This will be the first point, and then I will move to more detailed matters, if I still have some time, like digital archiving, changes in social definition of public versus private spheres, dissemination of results, and introducing of informed consent. So beginning from this first point, when reflecting on the contemporary status of biographical research, we may pose the same questions as we generally put when asking about the role of sociology and sociological analysis. Whether sociology or biographical approach should be focused on theoretical concepts, application of knowledge to rework social problems, describe and explain social phenomena and processes, or should it concentrate on critical attitude towards mainstream way of explaining of social reality? Elaborated analytical tools can be considered as the real epistemological achievement of biographical approach. Analytical tools based on sociolinguistic knowledge, as well as theoretical assumptions rooted in interpretative sociology, enable to undertake a subtle analysis of biographical constraints influenced by social barriers. In the contrast to quite typical social explanations pointing to schematic circumstances like social class, belonging, pathology, poverty, as a resource of various social behaviors, biographical analysis based on circumstantial reconstruction of processual sequence of biographical experiences shows how and in what way they might have happened. At the same time, we can point to a few elements constituting the stereotypical image of biographical approach. That is, biographical approach is easy to be done, though strenuous. Its results are blurred, subjective, and not representative. It is not easy to estimate its accuracy and reliability. One does not need special skills in order to do biographical research and to analyze empirical data. Thus, everybody can do it. These are the stereotypes, which are not true. The presupposition of easiness has varied negative consequences. Sometimes, or even quite often, biographical research is trivialized because it does not require any specific skills like knowledge of statistics or sophisticated computer programs. It means that no particular education is necessary. This conviction is often supported by mistakenly understood idea of interdisciplinarity, which says merging disciplines and attitudes is always fruitful. Whereas in the case of biographical approach, interdisciplinarity requires systematic knowledge from such fields as discourse analysis, social psychology, narratology, theory of literature, or sociolinguistics. Obviously, these competences cannot be acquired at equal level, and sociological approach should be the main frame of reference. Yet I agree with Norman Denzin and Yvonne Lincoln's statement that the multiple perspective put a researcher in the position of bricoleur who, I quote, works between and within competing and overlapping perspectives and paradigms. The bricoleur understands that research is an interactive process shaped by his or her personal history, biography, gender, social class, race, and ethnicity, unquote. The result of this work, Denzin calls a patchwork. The difficulty that may arise at this point, it is a possible mistake to treat this attitude in terms of the postmodern manner of merging all possible frames and sources. This overinterpreted idea of interdisciplinarity can be called conflation of methods and techniques in sociology. A very good example of it is the conviction that we can, or we even should, apply new technologies to analyze biographical stories like computer analysis, just because it makes our work easier, but without deeper reflection how it frames methodological reasoning, and that computer analysis of narratives is not just the application of a handy tool, but a different way of doing analysis or doing biographical research. Not better or worse, but first of all, different. The stereotype of the lack of the need to have special skills to use biographical approach results in a visible boom of this kind of research. Here I see at least two difficulties. Firstly, a lot of people want to use biographical research, but very few share the specific style of doing it. This style, which I could associate with the idea of universitas, in its origin is represented by a sociologist acquainted to a particular academic tradition, based on ongoing discussions, seminars not necessarily limited in time, the discourse free from pressure and project requirements. And so, in days of time-framed projects, effectiveness, estimations of overloading with didactics, this style of life seems to be awkward. As a result, sometimes researches are done quickly without material-grounded interpretations, and in such cases, the investigated problems do not prove the need to use biographical method. Especially young scholars, mainly PhD students, use this popular interpretative individual approach although they are not convinced that biographical research really has theoretical potential. The data would rather serve as good-looking illustration of the research problem. Secondly, the fashion of doing biographical research in different fields of human sciences complicates the situation also within the very sociology, where we meet extent methodological diversity, what results in different status of certain studies. The lack of shared knowledge sometimes leads to misunderstandings or even worse, trivialize the discourse among users of biographical method. For instance, the concept of trajectory of suffering may serve here as a good example. The theory of biographical and collective trajectories of suffering, developed by Fritz Schitz and Gerhard Riemann, coming in its origin from Anselm Strauss' work on interactions between institutional processes and terminal ill patients, can be considered as one of the best elaborated theoretical new key concepts showing the process of suffering and disorder and based on biographical analysis. However, it is hardly known and thus not understood. As a consequence, we may observe more postmodern than in other fields of sociology, jigsaw of attitudes and ideas, mainly represented by those who do not constitute theoretical frames, but they use biographical research in an instrumental way. In this context, we may find critical voices pointing that biographical research has lost analytical and epistemological power due to inflation of biographical studies and incorporation of biographical method into mainstream sociology. To some extent, it is true. The presupposition of easiness often leads to the situation when biographical research is trivialized. We are often confronted with researchers where the analysis stops at intuitive common sense, self-thought explanations, which can be defined as a homemade sociology or traditional sociology applying normative paradigm, though alluding to the repertoire of notions well attached to interpretative sociology or biographical approach. This critique refers both to methodological problems and, what is more serious, to epistemological issues. This was the critical power of biographical approach rooted in interpretative sociology, which aim has been focused on critical commentary of mainstream sociology, now is used by mainstream sociology itself. This kind of criticism was expressed by our colleague from this institute, Marek Czyżewski, in one of his papers, where he states that the more popular and influential, the more mainstream biographical method is, the more it is endangered by being trivialized or instrumentalized. When accepting this criticism, I would say that it is directed towards this kind of methodological not thinking, which actually should not be considered as real biographical research. Thus, we may pose a question whether each study that is called by its researcher biographical one really belongs to biographical analysis. Nowadays, such a question should be put more often, because I would risk a statement that biographical research is one of the most disordered fields in social sciences in terms of methodological reflection, although its raison d'être is data analysis. By expressing these remarks, I would like to pay attention to the paradox of contemporary biographical research. The biographical boom apparently changed the position of biographical method, but this nobilization that I would call fashion has not been accompanied by serious questions that especially new adepts of biographical research should pose themselves. What is what is real methodological, epistemological, and theoretical power of biographical approach and why I'm doing it. I devoted so much places to these methodological and epistemological issues because, in my opinion, they influence ethic of work understood as elaborated, systematic exploring of the methodology used by biographical researchers. I'm convinced that the described problems influence the contemporary situation when biographical approach has to face, or the researchers have to face, new challenges causing new type of ethical dilemmas. We can find a few such dilemmas. First is, I called archiving as a process of collecting data. Here we can consider both technical facilities and specific cultural phenomena. Let me start from the second one. An uncertainty of the future makes one look back to the past. This diagnosis forms a starting point for a French historian, Pierre Norat's explanation of rapid changes of the social memory in the past few decades. He claims that an uncertainty of what kind of knowledge about us could be useful to the next generations makes us record narratives about contemporary society uncritically. Since history cannot give us convincing visions of the future, duty memory comes to life, resulting from the emotions concomitant with the loss. This type of memory is called by Nora archival, which strengthens the attachment to the past. We are now at the point when duty of memory and archival memory have become a sort of a trap manifested in the lack of the idea what to do with and how to reuse this great potential of data. Although it refers mainly to the past and history, this trend has been transported to any other social scientist. We are expected to archive our results. It is also the expectation exported from hard sciences. How to ensure the anonymity, how to build the consensus between the researcher and the narrator, how to do it in different disciplines like psychology, sociology, or history, when each of them differently defines the relation between the researcher and interviewee and the status of the narrative as such. An explosion of memory was caused next to cultural processes, also by political changes, making it possible to reveal the once undisclosed and forbidden memory, leading to democratization of societies, acknowledgement of previously excluded stories like marginalized religious, regional or social minorities, gender minorities, underclass representatives, etc. Giving the voice to such groups, on the one hand, met the moral postulate of memory decolonization, but evoked other ethical dilemma on the other. A researcher often has to face the situation of being put to the role of social activist who will start a kind of social intervention on behalf of interviewees. So he or she is put in the role of an involved activist. People often think that a sociologist is a type of social worker who investigates reality in order to help to solve certain problems. This fact puts researchers in very uncomfortable position. Sometimes even imposed expectation of intervention may create the tension between scientific interests free from values and moral obligation to help people. What is even more difficult from ethical point of view, people usually expect that we will take at face value their way of seeing and interpreting social reality, and we will not deconstruct their way of thinking. They're using stereotypes or prejudice Namely, our analysis will not be a critical analysis showing how social reality is being constructed in the narratives and what are the consequences of this social construction. But this is not only the case of people's expectations, but also the question how a researcher will present the collected material, what can be done, for example, with biographical stories. They should be, of course, used for the research project as data, but they may also be used in various different ways, change contexts. A life story which original version is written or told, is a written or told narrative, may be, for example, treated as material for some artistic activities. To give two examples of good and rather problematic practices. The first one is the performance called The Tin Ring. I saw this performance a few times, but I take the description from the internet information about this performance. So the authors write, The Tin Ring is a dramatization of Holocaust survival based on a written autobiographical account by Zdenka Fantlowa, originated and adapted for performance by Jane Arnfield. The Tin Ring developed from a reflective process which sought to better understand the processual efficacy of verbatim testimony as an efficacious route towards improved understanding of the causes and consequences of genocide and mass violence. The method undertaken to mediate this testimonial of survival included identifying its distinctiveness through text excavation and transposing these testimonials into a live theatrical setting, reshaping the original encounter through different phases, detailing how first-hand testimony can be transferred from the host, that is narrator, to the first surrogate, that is performer, and transmitted onto the group surrogate, the audience, unquote. So I think it's a very positive example of reworking the life story with its author, that is the person who survived from the Holocaust, and then performing it, so giving it another meaning, but with as a result of negotiation process between the author and the actor, who is also a scientist. She works in social science. Another example, which for me is not that positive, it is the other practice. It was the project in which I also was a part. The project financed by European Commission called Euro Identities. We finished the project in 2010, and one of our colleagues decided to use biographical narratives to construct a sort of patchwork life story based on different narratives showing a sort of typical figure of migrant from Eastern to Western Europe. Now, the very word migrant has totally different context, but we were concentrated on migration within Europe. The project was to be based on material coming from this, the Euro Identity project, and its aim was to combine real narratives with artistic activity and the digital tools. And I was very critical about it because our colleague wanted to just pick up different types of experiences from different people and construct a sort of typical, I would say stereotypical figure of a migrant and give it and show it in internet by with help of actors who should play the role of these migrants. Now I move to the next point, which is also related to these examples: digital archiving and dissemination of results. Framing contemporary science, including social sciences and humanities, by the regime of projects changed the position of the researcher, who now is less independent when relying on sponsors. Nowadays, highly, if not the highest estimated results of projects are the dissemination of its findings, and often open access not only to the results but also to the collected data. We are also expected to go beyond academia. The book or scientific papers are not enough. We are expected to use new media. The term under umbrella of digital humanities used in documents of European projects is very well illustrates this approach. Whereas archiving of qualitative data raises a distinct set of issues surrounding confidentiality, interviewee, but also researcher anonymity, and interviewee consent. And I think that in this context, an informed consent can be sometimes a sort of illusory solution. Editing informed consent starts often to be one of very important stage of research. Creating text revised by lawyers should result with the document, sometimes quite long and difficult to follow, which will protect both the interviewee and the researcher. Introducing this procedure can be treated as a positive process of developing ethical standards and reflectiveness of researchers. But at the same time, it can be considered as one more sign of over-institutionalization of social practices. In case of biographical interviewing, the ethical definition of this situation lies not in well-prepared informed consent, but in the ability to base the interaction of mutual trust and respect. In other words, the informed consent does not release the researcher from the role of respectful and circumspect interlocutor, as well as it does not allow him to do everything with the data, even if the interviewee gives all his rights. And in this context, I would like to quote a quite interesting discussion or information that I found on the website of American Oral History Association, because there was a big controversy related to protecting of data. So we may read this note. I may read this note. New federal government protocols that better define the policy for the protection of human subjects have been announced in an effort to make more effective the promulgated regulations known as the Common Rule. According to the announcement, the final rule is intended to better protect human subjects involved in research while facilitating valuable research and reducing burden, delay, and ambiguity for investigators. These revisions are on an effort to modernize, simplify, and enhance the current system of oversight. The most critical component of the new protocols for oral historians explicitly removes oral history and journalism from the regulations. The final rule provides that, for purpose of this part, the following activities are deemed not to be researched: scholarly and journalistic activities, e.g. oral history, journalism, biography, literary criticism, legal research, and historical scholarship, including the collection of and use of information that focus directly on the specific individuals about whom the information is collected. The new protocols will take effect on January 19th, 2018. And there was a big discussion what to do, because it could happen that oral historians would not be regarded as researchers and that they couldn't do this kind of research. So the paradox is that after this discussion, they decided that actually the interviewees of oral historians are not human subjects. Because they agreed that actually oral historians do not research on people, but on the past. So the interviewees are just a sort of surrogate of the past, which is passed to the researcher, and they are not human beings. Of course, they are human beings, but not their humanity is the main point of research interest. So I gave this example just to show that we, on the one hand, we want to be very circumspect, and we try to think about ethical activities, to put them in lots of rules and regulations. But sometimes we may lead to the paradoxes, and we may hide behind these regulations, not reflecting on what is our real role of a researcher, how to be the relationship with the interviewee, and that we are always be obliged to follow the ethical rules related not only to written and accepted regulations in the documents, but also based on our own estimation of the situation, some empathy and sensitivity. I will skip. I think that because it's quite late, so I just read the last sentence of my conclusion. I will skip this last point of difference between public and private sphere. So just to sum up briefly, for sure the virtual sphere of our culture, accompanied by constantly developing technical tools of digital sphere, give new opportunities to store our data, to document social life, to continue intergenerational communication. But it also puts new ethical challenges that are multiplied by the contemporary style of our work. Mentioned methodological and theoretical difficulties. We as researchers are expected to be present, visible, to disseminate our results, to present them in open access, to share with our materials. For sure, we need regulations, ethical codes, but all these procedures cannot lead to another paradox, that we will feel protected by documents and not feel obliged to respect social rules of interaction and the very human practice that the research situation in qualitative studies, and especially in biographical approach, is first of all the situation of meeting with another person. Thank you.
Comments and questions? Yes, please.
Kaja, it's a very interesting, very wide-ranging presentation. I think you raised some very interesting and some very novel issues. Right, yeah. Kaja, you've given us a very interesting, a very wide-ranging review, and there's an awful lot of issues to comment on that we won't have time to talk about in this session. I mean, I think two things that there are two new things that for me that I would like to flag up, and then there's one thing I'd quite like you to respond to. On the issue of the way in which the archiving of data poses challenges of confidentiality for researchers as well as for research. I think that's a really interesting and novel point. I do want to think a lot more about that, because so much of our attention is focused on the implications for the researched. And I don't think we thought nearly enough about what open data means for researchers in this kind of context. I think also the shift in what informed consent means, that, if you like, when the data has remained in our possession, even if there's been a consent form, we've controlled the future use of it. And there's been a kind of implicit contract that's between researcher and researched that stands beside the consent form. Once it's put out into a repository, we lose that control. And people are being asked to consent for unforeseen and unforeseeable future uses. The researcher is not there as an ethical intermediary between the text, the narrative, the information that the interviewee has contributed, and the use that prospectively will be made of it. And again, I think that's something that the open data movement needs to be confronted with, much more directly. But the thing which intrigued me most, I think, is this tension between the analytic expectations of the interviewee and the analytic expectations of the interviewer. Because we're seeing a lot of pressure in the UK from our funders towards what they've bought the idea of co-production. They're very excited about co-production. There's this expectation that if you get a grant, you will co-produce the knowledge, which is fine until actually, because you find you're required to take the narratives you are given at face value. So if you're interviewing First Nations in Canada, you are not supposed to probe questions about the treatment about the sexual abuse of young people. That, this is off limits, it's defined as off limits, and you are not expected to cross those limits. You're not expected to ask questions about corruption, about the way in which government resources are exploited or diverted. It's a very common issue in many places. And it seems to me that that's a real problem if we're claiming to do a science of society. If we are actually not supposed to go behind the narrative, if we just take it at face value in that way. And I think you've kind of posed a very interesting question, and that's maybe the one I'd ask you to comment on a little bit more. I'm sorry, Christoph, I've talked for too long, but.
Answer? Okay, so thank you very much. Maybe just briefly about the position of the researcher, because I think that it's really a crucial point when maybe not Poland, not yet in Poland, but I know that in especially in the English social sciences, they are quite often even put all the material that were collected by a certain researcher because they are sponsored by university, by other organizations. So I think it's a big ethical issue because for the researcher it may be a sort of feeling of being just a hired worker who does everything, in order to develop his or her individual career, but actually he is engaged to do something and then to get rid of the right of his work. And I think it's really a problem for individual researchers, but also I think for the definition of these data, because they are always a result of some kind of social interaction and social context. And the researcher is the person who has the right to build this context and to interpret them. But at the same time, I think that we will have to solve this problem also theoretically, because we have more and more material which can be reused and reanalyzed. And on the other hand, it's a very good thing that now we can read materials coming from the 60s, for instance, yes, and they become a part of social history as well. We can compare, so it's very good for our development, the development of sociological thinking and so on. But it must be done very carefully. It cannot be done automatically that I do a project, I put it to internet, I give an open access, not only because of the interviewees, but also because of these researchers. And as for this analysis, of course, I didn't have the time to go deeper in details, but what I had in mind when I was thinking about this dilemma is a very complicated analytical procedure according to which, for instance, I work, this procedure proposed by Fritz Schitze, which is very detailed analysis of transcribed text based on the sociolinguistic knowledge and other tools. So, of course, our interviewees don't have this knowledge. And we don't go to them and say, okay, you will tell me your story, then I will write it exactly as you told it, with all these interruptions, signs, and so on. And then I will analyze it in such a way that you even cannot imagine what you said. For instance, there are these, we approach to the interviewee and say, to the narrator and say, please tell me your story. And he says, or she says, okay. And then he or she has something in mind what to say, but the rules of coming from sociolinguistic analysis say that when somebody enters in spontaneous narratives, one stops to control it, because there are constraints of narratives that lead him. So sometimes one says more than he or she wants, not even in terms of facts, but for instance in terms of emotions, in terms of interpretations. And this is problematic. What I usually do, if I have a chance, I go with my text to narrators, and I'm always very, very uncomfortable what they would say. This is the confrontation, because they confront with this analysis, and I could say a lot about quite positive examples. But just to give one more example showing this difficulty. 2 years ago, I and my two colleagues, we published a book based on biographical interviews with professors from our university. And of course, it was nonsense to anonymize them. We couldn't do it, but we also couldn't do the analysis. We just presented at face value this what they said, just maybe showing different perspectives and alluding to the reader that the reader should do the analysis by himself, because we are totally sure that the professors could feel offended when they read our analysis, because they told their story in different ways, there were different hidden contexts and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for a great presentation. I really enjoyed how you covered all the different aspects, but I would also like to address an issue, the issue Robert addressed, and I think it has to do with power, and also it's related to your last topic. Because there's a power relationship with these professors, you will have a different approach, and but so the biographical approach is really, trust is really important. You have to create an atmosphere of rapport and understanding, mutual understanding. But I've been in several situations in which I realized this person is lying to me, or this person is telling a slightly different story, and you know, how do you address that situation? You know, another colleague from South Africa, he, I think you were actually at that session, he interviewed a man over several years. You really are dependent on this relationship. So if you start an argument, or if you find out that, or you sort of this, do you really mean this? And I think we have to be really critical in all research situations. And I think one of the issues of biographical research is that we are too nice and too kind and too friendly, and we just, you know, represent the narrative. And I think this is really problematic, maybe for political reasons. In my case, I've been studying people who fight the banks in situations of foreclosure. So they're losing their houses and they're fighting these banks. And these people want to depict a glorious sort of narrative of their own struggle, of course. And I can accept it in some way. But I also understand if I will publish some of these things I actually don't believe in, this will actually jeopardize the legitimacy of my work, but also of this group of people who have a political activist point of view. So I really think that we have to be really critical, and this is problematic in biographical research. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I also gave these examples that when we especially go to people who think that we will represent their interests, or that they will describe their problems in the way they feel them, but we for instance see that they are either lying or are not. Okay, I will use this term, objective in their way of thinking, not objective, of course, in quotation marks, that they present just one aspect, yes? So, and of course, we are obliged to do it. This is the critical attitude of our research, but it causes these moral problems. What to do when they start reading our texts? But I think we should be critical, and we even should. Because sometimes it's quite easy to pass this limit between the perspective of narrators and the perspective of researcher, and we start thinking as they think. And I think it's not good when we go in this close relationship and we use this critical, and we lose this critical approach. We should be, first of all, we should be critical. But sometimes it's difficult to really solve this problem in the text, like in this case of these professors. We had really big problems, what to do. For instance, we didn't publish some parts of the text in which we knew that they were lying, for instance, because we had the evidence in the documents.
But did you confront them? Did you confront them with the lies?
No. But we, you know, it was some time of their life was in the communist times, so they didn't say different things, or they presented themselves in a different ways, and there are some documents, protocols from meetings, or for instance, party meetings.
You should write about that. That's really
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. But I think we should wait another 20 years.
Oh, you can use my name and Robert's name.
Yeah. So it's really, but I'm not historian. Historian is obliged to confront it, and we not. So we may also pass to some other social problems, but I agree, it is problematic. It is problematic.
Very briefly, not to belabor this point, but there's one issue that hasn't been mentioned. Lying was mentioned, distortion was mentioned. I found that people often have more than one identity in different circumstances, or they have gone through career changes, life changes, and they weren't the person they were decades ago. I'm not talking about mental illness, right? But there are certain audiences that you present yourself to in a certain way. Or you can present yourself to one and the same audience in two different ways, separated by a period of time, if you've just simply done something else and become someone else. And this is, just a spin on these 2 points that have already been discussed. It's not insincere, it's not a lie, but things have changed. I may be one person to my mother, I might be another person to my wife, I may be another person to my daughter, legitimately so. That's not the best example, but...
Yeah, I totally agree, but then it also depends on what kind of analysis you are doing. I do this analysis according to the Fritz-Schitze methodology, and the main assumption of this analysis, also taken from Labov and the Walецki rule, is that if somebody tells the story which is not pre-prepared, which is spontaneous, then one starts to reflect on his or her life, going back to the experiences and reporting them in the same way they were experienced. So of course the story in its plot may be a bit different, but the way of experiencing the life experiences would be the same. So for instance, if somebody suffered in a certain period of his or her life, this suffering will be visible in his or her story, but the narrative gives us this opportunity to compare the perspective, the past perspective and the present perspective. And this, what you said, is present in this present perspective in argumentation parts, not in narrative parts, but in argumentation, when people reflect and they say, oh, I've changed. Oh, maybe this 20 years ago I did this and that, or I estimated my situation like that, I defined it like that, but today I think I was wrong, or I think I will do the same, or I've changed in my attitude to people, so whatever. So this comparison of time perspectives gives us this opportunity to see what happened in the people's life, how they interpreted it during the life, and what they think about it nowadays. Yeah, so this is what I can say just in short, sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Kaja, for a wonderful presentation. And we finished this session, and we change now. We have very short break, and we change the room for the another sessions. And Magda, say you something.
Yeah, actually a short announcement. All the presentations that were scheduled to be delivered in room T301 will actually be held in room E8. So when you leave this room, please just turn right, take the stairs down, and the first room which you will see on your right is E8. E8. Thank you.